Hello everyone, this is the next session and you are going to deal with more practical aspects and you are going to do much more work than the day before yesterday. We very largely talked about the algorithm we are using to simulate the posterior distribution of the parameter. You remember there is no analytical expression for those distributions, and the only way that we have at how this goes out is via simulation to create a sample of parameter values that resemble the posterior distribution. In a nutshell, when we're using Metropolis-Hastings, which is to some extent the simpler and easier algorithm to simulate posteriors, we start at an arbitrary point theta 0, and then we are going to loop over the steps 2, 3, 4. So when we are at the board, we randomly draw a proposal for a new point theta star, and for that purpose we use what we call a jump distribution. That turns out to be a multivariate normal distribution centered at the previous point we were at, and with some covariance variance matrix of this jump distribution scaled down by a small c. We are going to talk about a small c a little bit. So those are proposal bias. Once we have this continuity point, theta star, we compute the acceptance ratio, which is the ratio between the posterior density of the new part, theta star, and the posterior density of the previous point, theta t minus 1. Because we don't need the denominator of the formula for the posterior, we can just compute the ratio of what we call posterior theta star and theta t minus 1. Once we have this ratio, if the ratio is larger than 1, meaning that the proposed point has a higher density than the previous one, we always jump to the new point. So if we can move toward an area of higher density, and if the density of the new point is smaller than the density of the previous point, then we are only going to jump with the probability corresponding to the ratio. So yesterday we essentially ran the algorithm. What we did yesterday is, because we didn't have any better information, we took as the variance matrix of the proposal, in fact a diagonal matrix, the variance of each parameter, the variance of the priors for each parameter. We found we didn't get it ideal on paper, but I found an adequate value for C. Okay, of course, the smaller the density of the new part is with respect to the density of the current point, the fewer chances there are that we are going to move, but still it is a possibility. The ability to move down in density is what lets us explore the tails of the posterior distribution. Okay. Of course, a diagonal matrix issued from the prior is not necessarily representative of the posterior distribution. In fact, the proposal will be all the better if the variance of the proposal is similar to the unknown variance of the posterior. We can proceed in 2 steps. After the first one, we can use this formula. We just have a sample of 200,000 and we compute the variance matrix, the empirical variance matrix of this sample. For each value of theta, we remove the overall mean in the chain and we do the external product of the vector. We sum them together and we divide by k, which is the number of iterations in the chain. In dinar, you can compute this formula simply by using the covariance of the first chain, which I call the first chain as a result of the RW and H function. Then we restart a new chain and there are essentially 2 to 3 things that change, mainly 3 things that must change. First, we change the initial value. You see, in the first instance, we didn't specify an initial value and therefore relied on the default of the Erdőm compute in dinar. That is, if there is no initial value specified, we are going to take the prior mean, okay? But now we don't want to take the prior mean, we want to continue where the first chain ends. To refer to the last element of the first chain, we use this expression, the value data being the last row of the sample. We want to take that element, but not just the last row. We take the last one because the last one is in fact the first posterior value of the parameters. Second, there was no specification of the covariance in the first chain. Again, by default, we took the prior variance. But now for the covariance of our new Metropolis-Hastings chain, we use the variance we just computed. This is because the new variance is more representative of the chain. Third, we can increase J scale, and then optionally in the first step we tried with one chain and now we do two chains. We tell Diner that we want to see the posterior density and the plots. There are several questions that come up when we want to set up Metropolis-Hastings. Two of them are very obvious. How many iterations should I do and what is a good value for MCMC scale? The two questions are related. The question of the number of iterations is essentially about convergence. Obviously, if we make iterations, we start from some point, and after a few steps, nothing tells us that the point we chose, for example, the prior mean, is representative of the posterior distribution. If we start from an arbitrary point, we will need the first iterations to hopefully bring us inside the identity region of the posterior distribution. At the beginning, we are almost sure that the generated iterations are not truly representative of the target posterior distribution. We hope to get there after a while, but we know it will take some time. Of course, the initial point must have some positive density, and as we just discussed, the chain depends on the initial starting point. Now, another thing we know, mostly because of the random walk part of the chain, is that the chain is going to be autocorrelated. This means there is a dependence between the next point and the previous point in the iteration. Because the chain is autocorrelated, we are going to visit the posterior distribution much slower than if we could simply take random points equally distributed under the support of the distribution. However, this direct approach of importance sampling is not feasible if we sample in a large dimensional space when estimating the values of many parameters. The first conclusion of this discussion is that we need to do enough iterations to reach convergence, to arrive at what we call the stationary part of the distribution. This is when we reach the high-density region of the distribution, and this sample proportionally represents the different regions of the posterior distribution. That's when we reach the stationary distribution. We cannot know a priori if we have reached stationarity, but we can test for it. Deciding the number of iterations to achieve this is something we will know only through experience. For a small model like this, 100,000 iterations are already quite a bit, though we will see that for some parameters it's not sufficient. Now, the other question that is related is how we set the scale of the proposal, the C parameter. What we see immediately is that C determines the average dispersion of the proposed points. We can imagine that if we make big jumps, there is a greater chance of hitting zones of low density, resulting in rejected moves. On the contrary, if we have a small c, we will make smaller jumps. Since we are starting from a point that was previously accepted, staying near that point increases the likelihood of acceptance. On average, if we increase c, we decrease the acceptance ratio. Conversely, if we decrease C, we increase it. The acceptance ratio also affects autocorrelation. If we make very small steps, the chain will be more autocorrelated than if we make larger steps. Presumably, if we can make a jump big enough, we will reach the stationary distribution faster than with very small steps. However, if we make jumps that are too big, their rejection rate will increase too much, which is also problematic. The optimal value for C is neither too big nor too small, and we have to find it. In summary, If we want to mitigate the problem, let me say one more thing. As I already mentioned, if the chain is autocorrelated, we will need a much longer chain to visit other regions of the posterior density. Another way of saying the same thing is that the more autocorrelated the chain is, the less informative it will be about the distribution. This is because autocorrelation means that new points add little new information compared to the information from the immediately previous points. How can we mitigate the problem created by autocorrelation in the Metropolis-Hastings chain? First, we should discard the first part of the Metropolis-Hastings chain because of dependence on the initial points. In Diner Julia, we don't yet have the option to set this proportion automatically. Second, we need to tune the covariance scale to minimize autocorrelation. That's one of the points we are going to discuss today. Finally, at the end of the generation process, we need to use diagnostics to assess the convergence and shape of the chain. The variance scale affects the average jump size of the proposal. The smaller the jump size, the higher the average acceptance ratio. However, if your jump size is too small, it takes a long time to visit your entire distribution. This increases autocorrelation. Conversely, if your jump size is too large, many jumps are so big that they fall into low density regions and are refused. As a result, because we are moving less frequently, it also takes a long time to visit the entire distribution. Therefore, neither too big nor too small a C is a good choice. In studies, the way to monitor and assess the effect of C is to look at the average acceptance rate. For some studies, it seems optimal to target an average acceptance rate and adjust C accordingly. But we will see there is one thing. Currently, you will only see the acceptance ratio of the MCMC chain if you're running a single chain. If you look at multiple chains, the acceptance ratio of the whole chain is not displayed. Here we are happy to see that the acceptance rate was 26%. Now, because we don't have it on the loss, it does not display successively. If you look at the trace of the chain, you see that the autocorrelation must be different from one parameter to the next. For example, the evolution of gamma Q throughout each iteration looks more autocorrelated. On this part, you see we started with the parameter for long-run inflation, pi a, which was high in the prior. The scale is not very clear here, but you see it started high and then very quickly went down. After that, it oscillates around lower values, okay? It's not as obvious for other parameters that didn't start far from their target. However, you see the cycle in gamma Q indicates higher autocorrelation than pi a, which is less noticeable. Then when you want to change, you can see if the parameters are similar. For some, they look relatively similar, but for others, it's more difficult to say. I don't know if that's due to the chains effect. You see it more in the distributions. For example, for RA, we have a very similar picture of the posterior distribution for one chain compared to another. For inflation, there's also a small difference. However, for gamma Q, in one case, we have something much flatter than in the other chain. Without further replication, we have no way to say if the true, in quotes, description is closer to the blue line or the red. For one distribution, we see larger values around 1000 in one chain, while the other has a flatter distribution. For PSI1 and PSI2, they look relatively similar. For RHO, we have better information and the deviations are depicted more accurately, at least the seeds. So now we had a qualitative discussion mostly based on the graphical outputs. Next, we are going to look at more quantitative indicators of the quality of the chains. For example, in this case, because we had an acceptance ratio between 20% and 30%, we might think there's not much to gain by moving C. We can still verify that if we go slightly beyond 20 to 30%, we don't see a gain in convergence. What this suggests is that a better way to improve the quality is to increase the size of the simulation. So what diagnostics do we have for the convergence of the MCMC chains? I followed the consultation of Simpson, Carpenter, and Berkner, which is now commonly used in current packages dealing with MCMC. This diagnostic is used in STAN, a famous package that may not be directly accessible in Julia, but is a standalone package for Bayesian estimation. It handles structural time series, Kalman filters, and Bayesian estimation. In fact, the advanced MCMC package that I use in Dynary, Julia, and MCMC chains implements these diagnostics. The key diagnostics are the R-hat indicator, which assesses the convergence to the stationary distribution, and the effective sample size, ESS, which shows whether a given chain contains enough information to rely on the results. In discussing these diagnostics, we assume we have 3 MM chains, each of length KKK, where MCMC replications equal KKK. One innovation of this approach is that instead of relying directly on the parameter values in the chain, we transform them using rank normalization. This is why many packages, instead of simply reporting ESS, provide metrics like bulk ESS. Here we also refer to ESS bonding. The reason for this transformation is to protect against the effects of non-normality. These indicators were originally developed based on asymptotic results for normal distributions, but they are not necessarily robust in non-normal setups or distributions with heavy tails. The transformation justifies the measure by addressing these issues. Each parameter value is first ranked, ordered as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc., depending on the rank. From the ranks, we compute normal scores using the inverse of the normal cumulative distribution function. The rank is divided by the length of the chain, with a small adjustment, 3/8 and 1/4, applied. This transformation improves the discrete rank measure by converting it into a continuous measure using the normal transformation. This addresses the issue of whether the results represent not just the dots themselves, but also the space between them. This small tuning adjustment resolves this concern. In what follows, we focus not only on the raw parameter setups, but also on the strongly normalized setups. R-hat, introduced by Gelman, one of the early authors of potential scale reduction, is a diagnostic commonly used in convergence checks after Metropolis-Hastings. The idea behind it is essentially variance analysis between chains. Even if you have a single chain, you can split it into segments to assess convergence. The way it works is that we compare the pooled variance, the overall variance obtained by pooling all iterations from all chains, with the average variance within each chain. If the chains are still strongly affected by their initial points, the variance within each chain will be smaller than the variance between chains. Once the within-chain variance matches the between-chain variance, we can assume the chains have reached stationarity. To calculate this, we first define the within-chain variance as the sum of the squares of the parameter deviations from their mean within a chain. We compute this variance for each chain M, then take the arithmetic mean of these variances across all chains to get the within-chain variance measure W. For the between-chain variance, we compare the mean parameter value in each chain with the overall mean, square these differences, and divide by the proper number to get the between-chain variance measure. Using the within-chain variance and between-chain variance, we compute the pooled variance as a weighted sum of the two, accounting for the length of each chain. Finally, the R-hat indicator is defined as the ratio of the pooled variance to the within-chain variance. When all chains have reached stationarity and are representative of the same process, the pooled variance and the within-chain variance should be identical. Ideally, the minimal value of r hat is 1, and the general recommendation is to consider a chain as converged if r hat is no larger than 1.05. Of course, this is a rule of thumb, not a formal statistical test. It applies only under strict conditions. However, like many diagnostics, the goal is not to make a binary decision, yes, it converged, or no, it didn't. Instead, we aim to determine if there are strong indications of convergence or if there are reasons to doubt it. If we look at our results, some r hat values are acceptable, while others are at the limit. For many parameters, there are doubts about convergence at the limit, suggesting that additional iterations would benefit the analysis. This provides further evidence in favor of increasing the number of iterations. Keep some precision. So you press on the idea in that direction. It presses on the idea of the effective sample size. In an autocorrelated sample, such as one generated by Metropolis-Hastings, we know there is less information than in a chain of the same length generated by random sampling. The way we address this is by first computing the autocorrelation coefficients at many lags for each chain. These lags range from 1 to ppp, and we compute them for each of the m chains. A good way to compute multiple autocorrelations at once is to use the fast Fourier transform algorithm, which is usually available in most programming languages. Dynar does not compute these directly, but relies on packages like MCMC diagnostics to handle this computation. Next, we compute the autocorrelation for the combined chain at lag t as follows: 1 minus the variance minus autocorrelation multiplied by the variance of the chain and divided by the overall variance. Finally, the effective sample size, ESS, reported as ESS bulk, is calculated as the total number of iterations across all chains, which is the number of chains times the number of iterations per chain divided by 1 plus 2 times the sum of a certain number of autocorrelation coefficients. In general, if there is no autocorrelation in the chain, the effective sample size would equal the number of chains times the number of iterations per chain. However, with autocorrelation, the effective sample size is smaller than this value. Both r hat and ESS discuss convergence, but only as far as the posterior mean is concerned. While these indicators assess convergence of the posterior mean, they do not evaluate other moments of the posterior distribution. For that, we would need to use other formulas or indicators. In the results, we also see ESS tail, which uses a similar approach but focuses on the lower and upper tails of the distribution. Here, the effective sample size is computed for the first 5% and the last 5% of the distribution, and the minimum of these is reported. In this case, the effective sample size in the tails is larger than in the bulk, indicating that more information is lost due to autocorrelation at the center of the distribution. For ESS, the recommendation is that we should not report the r hat measure unless the ESS is at least 200. This protects us from relying on chains that are too short. Nevertheless, this highlights the importance of autocorrelation. For instance, in this example, we have two chains of 200,000 iterations each, giving us a total of 400,000 iterations. However, due to autocorrelation, the information is equivalent to only about 800 independent samples. This demonstrates a significant loss of information caused by autocorrelation, and I think that's all for this session. See you